This week on The Futurists, JP Rangaswami.
I think where we're heading in that context is we will have open information that's generic and available to all industries, etc. We will have information that relates to a particular market segment, which is shared only by segment participants. But the real differentiator is the information that you create and you create uniquely.
Welcome back to The Futurists. I am your host, Brett King. And while I was on my travels in London this week, I ended up meeting with a good friend, a co-author to one of my books, Augmented, Life in the Smart Lane, which you guys might recall was got the mention by President Xi during his national address back in 2018, JP Rangaswami. Welcome to The Futurists.
Thank you, Brett. Always good to see you.
Yeah, we went out for a full English breakfast this morning, and now we're recording a podcast. Life could not be better.
And not just a full English, but one that costs less than £10.
Yes, we found a great place. So, you retired a few years ago, but you still sit on the boards of a bunch of companies. Prior to retirement, you were the CIO?
The chief data officer.
Chief data officer.
And head of innovation at Deutsche, and the chief scientist at Salesforce and BT.
Correct. Did you work with Brian Solis, our co-host on The Futurists at all, in Salesforce? I think you predated him.
But we knew each other, so we'd met a number of times.
Okay. Fantastic. So you worked in a role, obviously, a chief data officer these days is something that's quite common, but back a decade ago, this was
2014 when I was appointed in early 2014.
Exactly, this was very unusual. Now we have the rise of the chief AI officer and so forth, but I'm interested in your thoughts in terms of and we didn't sort of discuss this, but how do you think corporations are going to evolve with increasing levels of automation, increasing reliance on data? What does an organization look like when you start replacing humans in the workforce with algorithms and machines and autonomous factories and so forth? What are the competencies required for leadership?
I think that, maybe 30, 35 years ago, when people started talking about shaping away from the vertically integrated organization to one that was built around partnerships and an ecosystem, we learned something about the core competences of a firm in order to determine where its sort of right to play was. If we now zoom forward, it has changed so quickly to saying you also need to know what is the generic data you're going to rely on, what are the data sources that are specific to your market, and the data that's unique to you. So the differentiated value of proprietary data to standardized external data, and that comes from both closed and open markets, is a big deal. And the competence and the skill required to know whether you have data that is closer to the closed end of the spectrum or the open, and how you're going to maintain
where you
those
get the data from, what relationships or partnerships you need.
Correct, and how fresh it's going to be, why it would continue to be with you, how you can build a business around it. People have been talking about supply chains through the manufacturing lens for a long time. And we've understood, particularly during times of COVID or the Ukraine war or climate change, what happens when the supply chains break. We haven't really got to the point of corporations truly understanding their data supply chains.
Data supply chain. That's a good way to talk about it. Yeah.
Okay? And then you would know which things you have to have in-house. And therefore, you need the competences in-house. And it's not just about maintaining a supply chain. Some parts of the data supply chain are created, right? That's truly proprietary, right? And then the market starts moving towards saying players in a segment need to rely on a part of the supply chain that is not just unique but powerful. And I learned this the hard way in my first CIO job at Dresdner. We had about 800 systems in a complex, messy estate like anybody else did, and we were busy cleaning up. And I found to my consternation that even though I had shut certain systems down, the symbology that that system was generating was actually the language that other parts of the market.
So there was still legacy process or legacy policy that was reflected by those early systems.
In the same way as yesterday you flew into LHR, which is probably...
Why do we need a 3-letter airport code anymore?
When we've had, since 1973, I think it's probably LLGB as the ICAO sort of standardized 73 code. But, Calcutta, where I was born, only exists in a regular everyday form as CCU in the airport code. Mumbai exists as Bombay and BOM, and Chennai exists as MAA, Madras. And so what I'm fascinated by is the role of symbology within the shared data spaces in order to make the proprietary data spaces light up. Exactly.
But this really makes a point that organizations who are going to be leaders in terms of autonomous operations are going to have to play nice with other data sources. You're going to have to be open. You're going to have to be more transparent, at least, to get the right data. Is that?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, in interoperability, with some lightweight protocols, will dominate each market in ways that we've only just begun to learn. We should have learned it from the way that currency systems and airline systems worked and evolved. We should have learned about it the way credit card systems evolved. Lots of platforms that became ecosystems required that standardization, lightweight protocol, open access, and the existence of symbology. Okay? But now you have to think about it as true for every corporation in every market. And to become machine readable, some of these things are imperatives. Okay.
So, does that then make it hard to differentiate? Because if you're running off standardized systems or you have to create data standards, doesn't it sort of create this mediocrity where, you have to run on the mean rather than, differentiation?
Well, I remember a guy called George Gilder saying many years ago.
Gilder's law, man.
And Gilder said, every economic era is characterized by its own unique abundances and scarcities. And for a business model to succeed, it must take advantage of both the abundances as well as the scarcities. And I think where we're heading in that context is we will have open information that's generic and available to all industries, etc. We will have information that relates to a particular market segment, which is shared only by segment participants. But the real differentiator is the information that you create and you create uniquely. And so the race to the bottom that could happen when everything becomes gook is only if you have no differentiated capability and you're not investing in it, you're not building in it, and you're not knowing how to take it forward. And those skills are skills that are really hard to come by.
We have a situation right now where China is producing 8 PhD STEM graduates for every 1 STEM graduate the United States produces. But it's getting harder for those people to find jobs in China and elsewhere. And at the same time, in terms of the skill sets that make a difference in these organizations moving forward, the skills you need for future-proofing your organization for, let's say the mid-2030s, are so different from historically the skill sets that have made corporations robust and competitive.
Well, so one of the things that maybe I don't speak enough about is I chair something called the Web Science Trust.
Right.
And that was set up by Tim Berners-Lee, Wendy Hall, Nigel Shadbolt, Jim Hendler, people you would have known well in different stages. And the essence of setting that up was to say that STEM skills alone were not enough to make the web organic and real. We needed to understand about anthropology and about law and about
psychological behavioral analytics
and social aspects and human aspects. Therefore, it's not that STEM skills weren't required. They absolutely were. But they also needed to be augmented.
Right, but in the past we would have said, for example, an MBA or a finance degree was at the heart of commerce. And a lot of that functionality is just going to be algorithmic, right? So then what if you were, for your grandkids, what are you trying to get them to think about to make their careers future-proof? Because I get asked that question all the time.
You know me, so I'm going to go on a rabbit hole for this.
Go.
There was a guy called Erwin Chargaff, and he was responsible for fundamental research on nucleic acid. Without his work, we wouldn't have learnt about DNA necessarily. And yet, when the time came for Nobel Prizes to be handed out for the double helix and everything else, and we had Watson and Crick, and we've all heard about how someone like Franklin wasn't it's center stage at that time and why, but Chargaff wasn't really mentioned either.
No.
And I read an interview in one of the magazines at the time that said, Chargaff, we didn't really get any recognition at that time. How do you feel about it? And he said, research and science are inexorable. If you don't do it, someone else will.
Yeah.
But if Shakespeare hadn't given in to an impulse, if Beethoven hadn't given in to an impulse, if Picasso hadn't given in to an impulse, what they produced wouldn't exist. Okay? And when we go back to your generic and versus differentiated question earlier, I'm saying the same is true for the skills of the future. We have to understand what is commoditizing before our very eyes and buy into it and say, I don't need that, but I must know that the skill I'm trading off is a skill that I will not need in my vision of the future. Okay? And culture is going to be such a key element. We use terms like UX, right? But what we mean is codified culture.
How easy it is to work with your organization and so forth. It's very interesting because I've had this conversation about, we were talking over breakfast about branch operations and so forth. And, you listen to David Valles at Nubank, or you listen to Henry Ma, the CIO at WeBank. You listen to these people and they say, if you need to see a human, that is a design failure. Right? Because you should have been able to work out how to solve that problem in a better way, And I think there's an element of that when we look at cultural design from a CX perspective. If you are saying, oh, well, if it doesn't work out, they can always go see a human. In the autonomous, always on, instant gratification world, that's a problem, right? Although you could say that human interaction may be differentiated in the highly autonomous world. But it's like we've got to get through that cycle of full automation. before we sort of go back to, human level services and so forth. I think I don't think there's a way organizations today can differentiate with human service, because if you look at that, the cost of really good human service generally means, comparative to a technology-led approach today, it's prohibitively expensive.
I think I'd make two observations. You use the phrase always on, and that's really important, because one of the reasons why we can't let go of human skills right now is when the always on doesn't work.
Right.
Okay? So the edge case of saying you've lost connectivity, you don't have access to the data, the automation is failed.
But I mean, I get it, but that's less and less of a problem as time goes on.
But when you take into account that an autonomous system has taken over your plane and is relying on data that is incorrect,
Right.
and the pilot no longer has the ability to override. Okay.
That's an issue.
Until we have got to the stage of the systematic environment being intelligent enough to deal with the exception.
Well, as a pilot, I can tell you we're very close to that stage. Even general aviation aircraft like a Cirrus jet today has that level of automation where a passenger, if the pilot's incapacitated because there's a single pilot operation, can push a single button and it will land at the nearest available airport, communicating with ATC as it goes. It's pretty impressive.
And a colleague of mine from Deutsche days flew from Australia to Switzerland in a single engine, and he was telling me about the technology that was complex was actually to do with landing and getting permissions to fly again.
No, permissions
it's the KYC and the permissioning of the process, right? And what I'm claiming in a way is before we are still some level away from pure automation end to end, because the edge cases are unusual. I mean, only a few days ago, in two topics that came up, a council had decided that it could not allow apostrophes in road signs because they weren't machine readable, right? They couldn't write good enough code to deal with the apostrophes. The humans culturally over there were pedants about the grammar.
Right.
So they wanted to make it St. Mary's Lane with an apostrophe rather than without, and they hand painted the apostrophe. Okay? So when we build things that are machine readable, we need to know how we're going to protect them.
I know, but let's go 10 or 20 years in the future.
Yeah.
Presumably, we've got much closer to solving this. It's not going to be all or nothing. It's going to be fits and starts. It's going to be large-scale progress in certain closed-loop systems. More issues of compatibility between that. But we are hearing people like Sam Altman talk about the unicorn, the single employee unicorn company and things like this. So the market is already thinking about highly autonomous corporations that don't have a lot of people in them. That in itself presents a pretty real issue, because we are thinking about designing corporations that are humanless or humanless, right?
But I love listening to music. Okay, I love going to sports, and there is a market for robots watching esports between robots. Okay, but it's not a market that gets me out of bed. Okay, I like participative engagement. So when I go to concerts,
but that's the point of automating companies. So you can have
I agree. But what I'm trying to say is that when we come to like in the UK, I think we've currently got about 5.5 million SMEs and sole trader companies.
Right.
Okay, and for most countries, when you look deep into it, the small to medium end of it, rather than the corporation end of it, is where most of the economy is buried, right? And the Mittelstand in Germany or its equivalent exists everywhere. You've spent time in the US, you understand how the mom and pop store concept exists as well. So
and like the gigging economy workers and all of that is part of that.
The implication for that for me is, rather than think that, what's going to happen to the large corporation when we have the ability to say the setup in your garage, empowered by hyperconnectivity, driven by access to data standards and protocols, allows and switched on with sort of AI moving towards AGI, without arguing about when precisely. The issue is these trends are spottable. And therefore the ability for an individual to be able to create, scale, and act is therefore large. But in doing that, rather than think the large corporation is being slimmed down, what I'm actually seeing is that the spectrum of the small company is growing. So what is needed if instead of 5 million SMEs and sole traders in the UK, we had 20 million?
Right.
How will tax collection actually work?
Well, considering everyone could be on UBI by then, we probably won't have income tax.
Or, well...
we could have algorithm tax.
But the algorithmic process now has to work across a very different scale instead of saying 500 large companies. Because it's actually much easier to deal with an aggregated single company approach, because you can solve for things, okay? And we're having to solve for the long tail of saying you've got 20 million companies, each of whom is unique, right? We're coming to the same problem as we have with our own health, right? Yeah. Understanding every human being is unique, every cancer is unique, every physical and mental state is unique. We have to have some standards. We have to exchange queens, simplify the dashboard, in order to say, actually, wherever we're going to land up with some platform oligopolies. Okay? Sure. And they will become utility functions.
Even AGI itself could be that, right?
Yeah, and it becomes a utility function. And there, the utility function then starts dealing with the questions we've had ever since we created utilities. How do we make them fair? How do we make sure that they don't become monopolistic with collecting monopoly rents? How do you deal with the net neutrality kind of problem? How do you make it open to competition so that third parties can either compete or build on? How do you make them honest, right? Because we will need the utility, but you need regulators, you need watchdogs, you need very different forms of behavior.
Statutory.
And they're all for saying the value to the consumer at the end and the value to the small business, which is the alter ego of the consumer.
Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcasts, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific, and the FinTech 5. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network, and Next Gen Banker. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show. You've talked about culture, you talked about value systems. Presumably, with higher levels of automation, with climate change, and some people will debate this with me, we are shifting away from growth as the sole pursuit of the market. There needs to be better value systems. Call it capitalism 2.0, call it sustainable prosperity, the meaning economy, all these different terms that others have used about this. But If we do have high levels of unemployment, techno-unemployment produced by AGI and so forth, we have something like a universal basic income in place, then I would see there's a role for people to start building corporations that are more meaningful, more experiential, more focused on making the world a better place, fixing problems with climate and so forth. And if you've got a UBI, you can pursue these passion-based concerns and so forth. Am I being too idealistic describing a world like that in terms of where people are now pursuing ideas that add to the social good? Or, do you see capitalism hanging around for another 40 or 50 years?
Okay, the big question, and I'm just going to give an off-the-cuff answer. We've always known each other to say that's the best way of doing it. I think that growth is not the frame I want to understand its capacity. And everything, whether physical, silicon or carbon and human, has capacity constraints.
So you're talking about accessibility and inclusion, or?
No, I mean, size and scale and where marginal utility remains, where, you mentioned sustainable. The sustainability of operation has to do with the ability to use and reuse resources and how quickly the depleting resources get refreshed in every model. So every complex system has some concept of capacity, of constraints.
Scarcity.
Okay, and understanding those constraints becomes important in determining, it's almost like saying that when we first started talking about LLMs, and we had all the levels of positivity and criticism that came around, and I've been part of those discussions and debates, it was how long before we see pollution of original information by model-generated information, at which point would all the major players have finished eating the world, as it were, in which case everything becomes derivative and a variance and race to the bottom.
But you can't guarantee the sanctity of the data or the information.
And I remember going back to the days of, does IT matter? If you remember Nicholas Carr and 20 years ago and all that, and sort of saying, the smart thing for a corporation to do is to be a fast follower, okay? And you, I think personally, will understand the importance of this next statement. Follow whom?
Yeah.
Okay? So as we see commoditization go up the stack...
Who do we choose as those organizations that we put on the pedestal as that are
breaking new molds?
Right.
Because if everything's becoming sludge, if everything is becoming average out, if everything is just commodity, right, you need, and this is not about growth, it's about transformation. It's still understanding capacity. Whatever the pros and cons of Uber, right? My initial belief in saying I like the model was that a little bit of fiddling with the model of the taxi cab allowed me to have variable capacity, which meant that there were 10x more cars on the road, and the supply and demand corruptions had been solved. It wasn't a closed system of medallions. Anybody could become a part-time cabbie. And then we said, but not everybody likes this surge pricing from a cultural viewpoint. They cannot bring themselves to say, I'm going to pay $40 for a short cab ride. So you learn that there are ways of making capacity burst. Okay, and whenever you virtualize something, right, as we did with virtualizing the branch, and suddenly the ATM was your cash collection and deposit point, you had thousands more ATMs than you had branches. And then when cash started disappearing, the ATMs started getting boarded up.
Right.
It was supply and demand. When we saw something as strange as the server farms, until you'd virtualized it, we couldn't have modern infrastructure as a service.
Okay, but talk to me about those. Talk to me about the broad drivers in 20 years. How do you see us deciding on what should be the market's mandate? What should be the drivers for humanity as a species? Because things are going to change significantly in this 20 years. And just this, push for growth and push for profits, I feel like this is going to fall out of favor, but...
I think it already is.
Right.
Okay. I think you're absolutely right that when I was sort of working in tech, we used to say, if you were in the US and you came fresh out of college, you wanted to work for an investment bank in the 70s or 80s because that's where the money was. Right? If you were a little earlier, you'd probably go to work for Boeing or for United Technologies or Hughes or something like that because that's where the money was. We've always had the statements about your mother always wants you to be an accountant or a doctor or whatever else. But where do the youth of today want to work? And if the answer is everybody wants to be an Instagram influencer, we have some challenges coming.
Yeah.
Okay? Because what we set out as our goals of the future are what's going to drive investment in education. We may not want the further education institution that we have today, but we do want education. Okay? There's a bit of Lenny Bruce and every day millions of people are leaving church and finding God. Right? It's the nature of the institution may change, but the core belief. It's like banks will close, but banking is not going to disappear. Right. Education is not going to disappear. And we need the education in order to drive towards the skills of the future. And those skills.
So how does education evolve? Because, we see the Nordics models, being quite interesting emergence. You have Montessori before that and so forth. But these sort of standardized testing regime and so forth, it's clearly
I think more and more, and I've said this before, we're going to keep going back to saying education will focus no more about learning than about teaching.
Right.
Okay, and Sugata Mitra, one of my favorite teacher models, said about 50. He's the one who did the hole-in-the-wall experiments in India 15, 20 years ago. And he said, a teacher that can be replaced by a computer should be replaced by a computer.
Right.
Okay?
So is every student going to have their own AI that's going to be their constant teaching companion?
But guess what? They need the catalysts of the people who set their... whether they're engaging with that catalyst via video,
right,
or have the luck or joy of meeting the person in person, okay? You sitting in front of me, I'm hoping that somebody listening to you decides to set up his own bank with UBI becoming a classic facility with the understanding that a lending and credit process could be based not on past cash flows, but on future potential to do with social transformation in ways which we can't even conceive now, because in order for industry to exist, we need to understand the debt, credit, equity kind of picture that founds it, because the risk taker, the entrepreneur, needs a support network. Traditional support networks are gone. Where is the new support network going to come? It's going to be based on values and ethics. Right? And without getting further into saying the mechanics of UBI, I'm more interested in saying, when I say I have an idea and my idea is to change the world this way.
Do you think UBI is going to be the thing? Because it's sort of the only way we get to extend capitalism in a high unemployment environment, right?
I don't think that the current model of capitalism, which is driven so much by growth and the valuations in markets and the idea that the marginal price is meaningful in that context, etc. I'm also seeing that There are moves away from public listings.
Right.
Right? Are we going to have principally private markets? We've spoken about the role of
It's not sustainable, pun intended.
and platforms that are emerging have become challenges in their own right. Why are so many sort of groups of governments trying to figure out what to do with the digital giants? Okay, it's because we know that when we look 20 years forward, we know that there will be a new set of platforms. Okay, the railways or the credit card systems or the fundamental model LLM providers. It doesn't matter what we call them, but they're going to be some platforms.
Yeah.
And those platforms are going to be utilities and they're going to be regulated. And we've got 20 years to figure out what those platforms are and how to regulate them. And that's a continuum because we'll be doing it all the time for what's going to emerge 20 years forward.
All right, now let's take a different angle here. We've been talking a little bit about longevity privately this morning, but you've said, you're looking to when you're in your 80s and your grandchild is, getting married as a life goal around that. But what on that point, what excites you about the future in 20 years' time? What inspires you and what gives you pause or concerns?
I think that, there is no scarcity for bad news. I can fill my day if that's what I want to by looking at all the reasons to have nightmares. And it doesn't make me unsympathetic or cynical to say, yes, all that is true. And I always want to care about humans and I feel I'm a steward of everything I am. But stewardship is not necessarily taught. I think that the state we're in today, stewardship will be taught.
Yeah.
Even a concept like UBI is to me a variant on stewardship.
Yes.
It's about resource allocation with a future goal in mind. Right? Equity is not because I want to say kumbaya and hug a tree.
No, but it's like instead of survival of the fittest type mentality, there's a recognition that the economy's most basic function must be to provide for citizenry.
Yeah, and that it starts coming back to things like the most important element is dignity. Okay, and it's a big word. It can be expanded and corrupted in many ways. But dignity of humans, dignity of animals and plants, dignity of everything we are stewards for, right? A basic right of that is to have something that looks like respect, something that says there are some rights, and something that says there are some duties. It's an evolved relationship. But it's all going to be around dignity. I remember many years ago watching a TV program where some famous consultant was interviewing an Indian Maharaja, which is mainly titular, but he was still very, very rich. And this guy said, Maharaja, I've gone through your kingdom. And good news is you have 6,000 people who are surplus to requirements. And this guy looked at him and said, 6,000 people surplus to requirements. What are you suggesting? He said, well, you can fire them. They don't have to be part of your payroll or anything. And then he looks at them and says, but what will they do?
Yeah.
Okay? And wherever we've looked at complex human conflict
isn't that the most positive aspect of UBI is that people can do things that are meaningful without having to worry about putting food on the table?
But in I agreed, and this is going back to the Edwin Chargaff, and culture, or Torsten Veblen, 120 years ago, writing about the theory of the leisure class. Okay, leisure is meaningful to me when it can be allowed. Again, taking an aside, I was taught when I was young. The first generation breaking away from agrarian into industrial society starts creating the wherewithal to send their next generation to school.
Right.
Okay.
And it was the Industrial Revolution that created the public schooling system.
Yeah. Then the schooling system created people who knew how to save for a future in order to create a next generation that would allow people to get into culture. Right? You need money to be a musician or an artist or whatever else, because patronage models were the old style.
Right, yes, of course.
Modern patronage model is like a self-sustainable model for it. Right? And we're building things, whether we're going to call them Substacks or OnlyFans or whatever else, saying there are ways you can earn a living. I hate the word monetize.
Right.
I prefer to say earn a living. How do you earn a living? You, rather than saying follow your passion, the more modern way of saying it is, I think, understand what you're good at and then master it. And then when you're really good at it, you will get paid. And Peter Drucker used to say, people make shoes, not money. Shoes are the product. Money is an end result. Choose the shoes you're good at. Okay, you've chosen the shoe you're good at. Okay, and then if you're good at it, money will come. Not because you're interested in getting money, but because you're good at making shoes. And so just keeping with that, 20 years from now, it's about empowering people to find the skills that they're good at, to master them, to understand how sustainable value can enter society, and then to build the ecosystem and to remove the barriers that prevent them from doing it today.
All right, so we've got to wrap up because I know you have to keep moving on. But right now there is a general election coming in the UK. So let me flip that and say, in 20 years, what does government look like?
Okay. For long, I wondered whether, governments used to work as sort of large aggregations because they said, I'm going to control borders and I'm going to guarantee safety and security for you in exchange for extracting a tax from you, for which I will build the currency and I will create the concept of debt, as David Graeber tried to remind us. And all that worked when border controls meant something. Right? We can talk till the cows come home about migrants and border problems.
Borders are unsustainable.
But the reality is that even in 2016, I think the World Economic Forum said, of the 100 largest countries in the world, 61 were corporations.
Yes.
Okay? Yeah. And corporations can reform themselves at a moment's notice. Right. Change tax structures, change APIs, change processes. In a way, countries can't physically reform themselves anywhere near as easily. Okay?
Are countries an inefficient organizing principle?
And as a result of that, they are. And, devolution and bringing to smaller groups and city-state kind of stuff is meaningful. But guess what? The best ecosystems rely on the 1,000-pound gorilla, the core, the moderator function, etc. And our challenge is to create these new ecosystems where the empowerment of the city, the recent elections that just went through in England, there were 1,500 councillors elected and probably of the order of, I think, 107 councils. But a lot of the headlines was about 5 mayors.
I saw this guy going for mayor right now. He just beat out he's like got a bin.
Count Binface.
Binface.
Yes, Count Binface. I think he got more votes than Britain First.
Right, exactly. Okay. That was insane.
But the point to me was that the mayor elections became a bigger deal than the councils because they still are the old model. Aggregated power over a large scale. But actually, like the SME argument of the single person super company, right? We have to learn how to coordinate, encourage, evolve, develop, protect millions of small companies, and the modern concept of democracy. Okay, an aside on democracy.
Consensus building becomes really important,
and learning to have differentiated views without going into polarized.
Without having to have,
it's if you're not with me, you're against me. Actually, no, we're in it together. Yeah. Can we start again? Right? No one wins. If you
This
say,
very Aristotelian view that the only way for humanity to thrive is together as a unit.
yeah, I learned a little bit more about the concept of ostracism. Okay, that one of the forms of democracy in ancient Greece was election by lot.
I think if you've got UBI, some sort of national service where you have to participate in
government,
I think is fair.
And you have to behave in a way that is valuable to society. And if you don't, you get given a yellow card. And if you don't, you have a red card.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, so JP, I want to thank you for your time today. We've run out of time, but how do people keep up with your musings and your thinkings on these matters?
I'm doing a lot more reading than I'm writing right now. I'm in a lull. I have a blog, but 3 or 4 times a year.
Are you on LinkedIn, Twitter?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm Jobsworth on Twitter and on Threads.
Fantastic.
But always good to catch up with you, Brad.
Wonderful. It's wonderful to see you. I wish you all the best. Thank you for lending us your insights from decades of incredible work in the corporate field. And I think I share many of your views that things are entering a very interesting period of change. And we have to think about what are the platforms of the future. And instead of just letting this happen with the biggest corporations, we should be designing for the future we want. Yeah?
Absolutely.
That's it. Welcome to join us again next week on The Futurists. Thanks for joining us. And JP, thanks for giving us your time.
Well, that's it for The Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.